The US has been at war continuously in a much more direct way since 9/11, going on a couple decades, and it has a long history of war and occupation before that. And there are many reasonings offered for those wars: national security, preserving peace around the world. What do you see as the overarching reasons why the US invades countries and declares wars that we just heard so much about, both here and abroad? And I think we'll go to Crystal first.
Awesome. Thank you, Brittany. Apevashev, Mene Wostat Nanehav. My name's Crystal Tubles, my English name, Crystal Tubles. As Brittany said, I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. First, I think it's important to note that the U.S. has been at war and occupying territory on Turtle Island since the U.S. as a country's inception, right? And so for us to like get to the roots of really understanding militarism, we have to look at the birth of America, right? The birth of the United States. And for me, as an Oglala Lakota Northern Cheyenne woman, that conversation always goes back to like colonization, right? So to understand militarism, we have to understand colonization of Turtle Island in the role that the U.S. military at that point, that wasn't even called the U.S. military, played in that. And so I always say the U.S. military was actually formed around indigenous resistance to colonization, right? So everything from the strategic locations of forts and now bases to U.S. highways where they are located at, to the names of missions, the names of bases, the names of military equipment. All of that is rooted in indigenous resistance. It's rooted in the military, the enforcement of our genocide and our oppression and our continued oppression, right? And so I think if we're going to talk about militarism, to have a well-rounded analysis of that, and even on into US imperialism, we have to understand what colonization of Turtle Island looked like. Obviously I could go on and on about all the different examples, but I mean, even just looking at the state that we're currently in with COVID-19, right? Smallpox was introduced to Native people and indigenous peoples through blankets given out by the US military to our peoples. And so right now, this current state that we're in is really scary. And it's very reminiscent, whether it was intentional or not, it's very reminiscent of that time frame for us, of that being introduced intentionally. And in some tribes, wiping out 90% of their population. And so we almost didn't make it through that period. And so this time is definitely a scary period for us as well. Even looking at residential boarding schools, when we were forced away from our lands to be disconnected, the military enforced that. Whenever they couldn't move us all to one place, then the military then tried to keep us all on our reservations and enforce that. And then when they couldn't deal with us in that situation, they kidnapped our children and they put them in residential and boarding schools. And those boarding schools and residential schools were actually modeled off of the military boot camp. And so everything about the oppression and colonization of our people is rooted in militarism. And then that template was then, or that process of colonization was then taken as this like template in this framework to place onto other indigenous communities, lands, other countries, right? It was placed on them to then access their land, access their resources in the same ways that they did to our land and to our resources. And I know that's a very simplified way of looking at it, but it's actually a very palatable way to understand the way colonization, militarization, and US imperialism are like all connected and all related, and so it's important to really bring it down to that level and understanding and rooting ourselves in indigenous resistance and understanding that that's where we start. And then from there we have stolen peoples, and we have forced labor, we have mass genocide, all of these things that we can tie together, that bring us to this current state that we're in, and these current conversations that we're in. And so for me, it's all about access to resources. It's all about access to land, and it's all about power and all about control. And it's all about understanding how corporatism and corporations are backing all of that, right?
Yeah.
And they are pushing all of that. but yeah, so just making those connections all the way back to Indigenous resistance into our current state. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Crystal. No, that's a great summary. So we're going to go to you now. I think that that's a great place to transition, right? Which is that piece about corporatism. So we've talked about kind of the very like even social roots and understanding of how we got here. But then, like what causes people, I saw a comment in the chat about, are we going to talk about how Black and brown and poor people are recruited into the military? So Corey, if you could tell us a little bit about how that machine works and connects to what Crystal was talking about.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with Crystal more. It's very important and right that we are looking at the very obvious failures of the president and various government officials in terms of managing this crisis. But it's really important to look at the histories of the kind that Crystal is describing and the structures and institutions of this country. And I think it's especially useful to look at what structures are and systems are working properly right now in which are failing. If we talk about healthcare systems to keep people alive, to take care of people, those are largely failing, not in terms of the individual medical professionals who are sacrificing so much to help people, but the institutions that they work in clearly were unprepared for this crisis. On the other hand, the institutions of militarization and colonization are robust enough to continue throughout the crisis. And so the kind of history that Crystal talked about, it is a living history, and that colonization is ongoing. As our comrade and relative Seokla, who opened this event, said, the Wampanoag tribe, Mashpee Wampanoag tribe here in Massachusetts, where I am, was on March 27th informed that they would be de-established. March 27th, as the crisis is peaking in New York in terms of the outbreak, and this healthcare systems are failing, the Department of the Interior is still functional enough to attack this group of Indigenous people. It's also worth looking at the fact that at this, we saw that a hospital ship was sent by the Navy to New York City and another one to Los Angeles to help with the outbreak. 12 days before the hospital ship arrived in New York City, the United States Navy, the same Navy, deployed not one but two aircraft carrier groups to the Arabian Sea to threaten Iran. And so we're looking at decisions that were made before this crisis, systems that were built before this crisis that are far more prepared to kill and conquer than they are to take care of people. And so it's really important that we now interrogate what are the institutions that make up this country, because we need to completely transform the priorities. And frankly, these systems around killing and militarization shouldn't exist at all.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. That's a really good point. And I think that the word I want to highlight that you just said at the end there is priorities, right? That it impacts the priorities of what gets invested in. And so I want to go to Crystal next. Crystal, you and I are both vets. We both are here speaking about these systems and yet participated in this system. And so, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about like the economics of that and who kind of sets the priorities for us both on an individual level, right? And how we make decisions about the resources we need in this society that we have, and the way that that connects to the ways that our people, right, are kind of in many ways tricked into being told, hey, if you sign up, you're going to be able to serve humanity, you're going to be able to save people, you're going to be able to be a hero, right? And the ways that that serves to have priorities that that maybe don't actually end up serving us the way that Corey is saying.
Yeah, I think you summed that up really well. I think like the key part that I kind of take from that and want to look at more is, at the Highlander gathering that Ash spoke about in the beginning of this webinar, a colleague and a friend had said the US budget reflects our values as a nation, right? And so where we are investing our money says what our values are. And at this moment, the US military is like the most funded over universal health care, over education, over housing, and so many other needs that we have in this country. That is what we are telling the world is our values. we value killing. We value imperialism. We value access to these lands, access to these resources. And then what that also says is that we value the oppression of indigenous peoples. We value the oppression of voices that are actually trying to defend the lands and defend people's rights all over the world, not just in the US, but all over the world. And I also think like, that's kind of the more visible piece as far as the what we value and what we're investing in. But I also think that, as an organizer, what I've seen too is like just looking at the overall corporate profit has rights over the people's rights, right? Like we value that over that. And that is what is driving everything going on right now is corporate profit. And our country enforces it. I mean, just like with organizing it with the Dakota Access Pipeline, I was sued for that. And they turned around and they tried to criminalize my First Amendment rights to defend, and even my inherent right as an Indian, as a Native woman, as an Oglala, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne woman to steward the lands. They actually sued me for those rights. And so I think criminalizing organizers and activists that are actually here to defend happens at the cost of that, right? So we're valuing that. Many of which are the same people that are providing the very mutual aid in our communities for COVID-19 currently, right? Like we're the ones that are organizing like that. And we're also the ones that are on the front lines at these different battles. I think also just really quick is just looking at like, as far as on the home front, looking at the militarization of police and the way police are actually enforcing the rights of these corporations, the very corporations that are pushing the agenda for US imperialism, right? And so we're actually militarizing our police here on our lands to enforce those corporate rights, to enforce corporate profit, or the right for corporate profit. And so it's important to look at that, especially when there's so much going on here and abroad. Dakota Access Pipeline, KXL, Line 3, Mauna Kea, Wet'suwet'en, at the border. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the different fights that we are all currently engaged in. That's not even going into our relatives abroad, our relatives all over the world. And that's all being driven by corporate greed, really. And that's what's driving the US imperialism. And that's where our values are currently as a country, is we are investing in that currently.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. Beautifully put. So we have about 4 minutes left for this discussion. So Kuri, I'd love for you to kind of bring us home. Crystal, I think, gave a beautiful articulation of the fact that a lot of these things are happening for profit motive. I know that when I was deployed, we spoke openly about how we would see contractors just all over the place, making so much money. So tell us a little bit about the relationship between those corporations that we're referring to and how these policy decisions end up being put into place.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's very clear. I think the big question is, we know that the United States is the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. And it's worth asking why that is. It's worth asking why, when we think about the energy corporations, for example, in this country, what has it taken for them to become so powerful and so wealthy? And it's not only the kind of colonization of this place, though, again, as Crystal is talking about, it's clearly the pipelines are central to that, especially recently, but actually they have a long history. But also the US's control, and the control of US and Western corporations, energy corporations in particular, of places like the Middle East, which is rich in petroleum. The control of the ways that US corporations are able to access markets around the world. The fact that US products like Coca-Cola are ubiquitous, it's not because Coke tastes good. It's because the US, through violence, has made it so that all around the world is a market for these products and for these corporations. Now, I hope and I believe that in this country, we're watching what's happening in response to the pandemic and seeing, again, profit reign supreme. In Boston, where I live, as we are preparing for more casualties and infections with COVID-19, we still have private hospitals. They are still trying to figure out, how do we maintain profit while dealing with a mass influx of patients? it's time to question, it's past time to question the role of profiteering in healthcare, every aspect of it. And I hope that as we do so, we question the central place that profit plays in everything about the society, not only domestically, but in terms of what it does abroad as well.
Thanks, Turi. Absolutely. So we're going to hand back to Mark, but I hope that folks really have a chance to think about this and to bring it back to what we talked about on the previous panel when we used this like word that I only learned a few months ago, neoliberalism, right? I think an example of what we're seeing is we just heard all of these reasons, right? That we're told, oh, okay, when you're a troop, you're told, oh, you're going to help the Afghan people, you're going to, uphold American values, and yet we know that over 507 members of Congress, current Congress, which is one of the more, we had some progressive wins recently, are still accepting significant campaign contributions from those defense contractors, who then in turn, receive billions and billions of dollars, sometimes up to over 90% of their corporate revenue is tax dollars. And so, when we realize that, we see that there's a cycle of legalized profit and legalized corruption that happens that we refer to as the military industrial complex. And that getting at those roots, both cultural and structural, is what it's going to take for us to move into the society that we're dreaming of, right? That values creation and building instead of destruction and death and violence to try to solve all of our problems. So thank you so much again. It was an honor. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mark.
So zooming out now to a global perspective, let's talk about U.S. militarism abroad. For Hoda, do you see connections to what Manka and Melody just discussed?
Oh, 100%. And thank you so much for just all of that really, really amazing conversation just leading into this. I think that everything that you said is so important and so deeply connected. I think that what is really important to note is that we have a culture of militarism in the United States that has really just created a false reality in order to justify its own existence and its continuous expansion. So America builds cages, as we all mentioned, and fills it with our people's bodies and calls it justice. But it also bombs Afghanistan and calls it freedom. It also administers violent sanctions on Iran or embargoes Gaza and calls it humanitarian alternatives to war. And also bans our people and militarizes the border and calls it national security. And so we're seeing all of these words being thrown around in securitization and safety. But what is especially notable, and in this particular moment in history with COVID-19, is that this virus has shown us almost overnight that none of this is not only not true, but in fact, it's the opposite that keeps us safe. So over the past few weeks, hundreds of people who were incarcerated were released due to the incredible work of badass organizers around the country. And just 2 months ago, Trump had doubled down on the Muslim ban and expanded it. But now he's begging for people to enter the country on expedited visas. So we see that the US is sort of falling apart in many senses, but that's because these systems of capitalism and militarism are not made to keep us safe. If keeping people in jails made us safe, then why did they agree to release hundreds overnight? If militarized borders keep us safe, then why can we now get expedited visas to come into this country? We're actually
intervene real quick here, ask you to slow down a little bit, because this is being simultaneously interpreted.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think we see we're actually safer when people are released from jail. Right now, if people are still in jail, that actually is going to make the virus spread faster. And so when people are released, it actually keeps us safer. Decarceration keeps us safer. When resources are diverted from making weapons into or maintaining the United States' nuclear weapons and not funded into healthcare, we're unsafe. And so when we see bills like the authorized use of military force or the AUMF, it makes it even more outlandish, because giving a green light to use all necessary and appropriate force to secure the homeland is bullshit. Because where is our safety right now at the hands of the gross incompetence of the Trump regime in containing COVID-19? And it's already cost the lives as of today of over 10,000 people in this country alone. So you want to use all necessary and appropriate force to shoot the virus with your shiny new tank? And so 100%, yes, this is about safety looks like diverting those resources from the military and the military complex to healthcare, those $700 billion spent annually on endless wars, to education and to reparations and to healthcare. But I also want to be very clear, and this may be a little bit of a controversial comment, but I still want to say it because these resources aren't even ours to begin with. This wealth is produced in sweatshops in Ghana and Cambodia and Bangladesh, and it's mined in Burkina Faso. It's stolen from Iraq and Iran. And so this culture of militarism has not only warped our worldviews of what is safe, and it diverts our own funding, our own resources from from healthcare to warfare, but it also has us delusioned as to what is even ours to begin with.
Hoda, can you talk about the failures of US foreign policy and what you see as the long-term repercussions of how the US is responding to the pandemic right now?
Oh, everything. There has been no success with US foreign policy. I think that what's like the long-term like product of the current response to COVID is also a historic one. The fact that the United States feels like it can solve everything with a police and army, just as was just mentioned right before, like mental health crisis, send over the police. They have like this disease, this virus spreading around the world. They want to deploy the army. So I think the fact that militarism is being reused as a response for everything is deeply, deeply devastating, because then it justifies the use of all these resources. If it's responding to every issue, then it needs more funds to be able to respond to these issues. And it's also policing of our everydays, both domestically and abroad. It's the policing of bodies, particularly bodies of color, to fit capitalism, to fit secularism, and to fit neoliberalism. So it's a way in which it also affects our every single day and the ways in which we even are allowed to step outside of our homes. And it really is, I think, it also creates, and I'm assuming based on the audience of this town hall, that I also want to mention that it also creates a sense of US exceptionalism in our movements as well. Even more left-leaning groups and spaces also has a sort of militaristic feeling many times. If we look at US militarism and non-strategic allyship, actually work hand in hand to delegitimize and flatten people's movements globally. So when we're not actually taking directives from people on the ground and still feel like we can do a top-down approach to global solidarity and not listen to organizers, that is not only delegitimizing, but it also is reproducing our own savior complexes. And so I think that we see this, for example, with Iran all the time, that we don't feel like there's no other agent that can be problematic or that can do good or bad aside from the United States. So I think that's something that's important for us to recognize, is that we can understand that American imperialism is deeply devastating and militarism is deeply devastating, but also the Iranian regime is corrupt and is repressive, as is many other regimes around the world. And we can understand both of those together and understand that the people in Iran are suffering between a rock and a hard place. And if we're not strategic about our allyship, we can actually worsen those conditions and play into the Iranian regime's own propaganda and its own agendas of militarism. So I think that we have to understand that we do have an obligation as people living in this country to take responsibility for US imperialism, but not at the expense of people's movements on the ground in these countries abroad as well. And so we're being called on by the people of Iran to end sanctions. We're being called on by the people in Gaza to lift the blockade, being called on by the people of Kashmir to stop doing arms deals with India. And so I think that the calls that we are getting is very clear. But if we are not able to decentralize ourselves, even in leftist spaces, we're only recreating US exceptionalism and the culture of militarism.
Yeah. So I have a question that I was hoping that you could address with me. What could the world look like if the U.S. took the step of demilitarizing our policies outside of our borders and made reparations for the harms the U.S. has caused globally?
Thank you for that question, Reese. Thank you, Barbara. I'm really honored to be on with everyone in this very important moment for us to talk about, what we imagine our future can look like. And I think something we could, really use in this moment is inspiration from all the activism that everyone on this call has been talking about, is themselves engaged with, the organizing, the advocacy that's happening across the globe. And I think the first thing we will be able to accomplish when the US sees itself not as an imperial power, a superpower to control everything, what we will see is how much amazing work is happening across the globe to fix the collective problems we see and having to deal with, whether it is climate change, whether it's demand for environmental justice, indigenous rights, and anti-colonial struggles, anti-imperialist struggles, the demand for anti-dictatorships. All of that is hard when the United States, and not only the United States, but definitely the United States sees itself as a superpower that needs to control everything. And I think it's very important that we don't fall into that mindset either. The fact that, I think Huda earlier talked about US exceptionalism, and I want to take that concept a little further in terms of thinking about US exceptionalism as a way to assume that we are the ones needing to help people survive. We need to save everyone from the United States, when in fact, people are across the globe are resisting, people across the globe are doing direct action, people across the globe are agents of their own future. And we need to learn from them, and we need to build with them. We need to learn across struggles. We need to build across struggles, but also across borders. Last month marked 9 years, for example, since the start of the revolution in Syria, which was part and parcel of revolutions across the region, from Tunisia to Libya to Egypt to Bahrain to Yemen to Iraq, all rose up and demanded the fall of their regimes. And yet today, we don't remember and we don't talk much about the beautifulness of what happened in that region. We talk, the singing, the chanting, the protests, people creating organizing networks, people creating mutual aid networks, people launching radio stations, people creating artwork and music to capture and inspire others to join, the local councils that popped up in order to discuss protest plans and start imagining the future of their country. What we instead talk about is the war, which is important. We talk, the air wars that happened, the imperial powers that stepped in to crush these protesters, whether it was the United States or Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iran or Turkey. And yet, what happens when we focus in on only the horribleness of war and blood and air wars and bombings is we forget that people every single day are resisting and surviving, and we need to honor that. And the way to honor that is to step back and learn from people out there, people who have been struggling for centuries. Just like we here talk about the need to learn from indigenous struggles, the need to learn from Black struggles, there are struggles across the globe that have been building for so long, and so much to learn from them. And this is particularly true when we talk about the need to resist air wars, which is this network that War Resisters League is working on, is the idea that it's not good enough to just highlight the destruction and to bring attention to that. We also need to talk about the way people have agency in resisting these air wars, and talk about the need to finally dismantle the war on terror. And the only way to do that is really to take the lead of those who are impacted day in and day out, and follow them as agents of change for their own future.